part of Cleveland Neighborhood Progress Institute series. A few details and reminders. If you could keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar to avoid background and noise and interference, we'd appreciate it. Please use the chat feature to ask questions. Melinda Gigante and Pam Fine will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. As time allows, we'll have a Q&A at the end, and we'll collect any unanswered questions to answer at a later time. We are honored and excited you've joined us as participants today. This session will provide you a deeper understanding of fair housing law on the federal, state, and local level, how it impacts your community, and tools and advocacy opportunities to combat housing discrimination. Today's presenters are a trio of incredibly talented, driven, and highly skilled women. Tanisha Hunter manages and leads the Fair Housing Center's education and outreach efforts, which includes coordinating trainings and educational programs. He promotes fair housing education by providing comprehensive overviews of fair housing law to a variety of audiences, including municipalities, real estate professionals, landlords, social workers, and consumers. Tanisha earned her undergraduate degree in gerontology from Bowling Green State University. She's a proud alumnus of Cleveland State's Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs, where she received a Master's of Public Administration. During her graduate studies, she was awarded the Wallace G. Tier Prize for her advocacy for quality housing. She was also published by the ACLU for her article, No Section 8 Means No Opportunities, which highlights issues associated with the source of income discrimination. Prior to working at the Fair Housing Center, Tanisha worked as an administrative manager for the City of Cleveland's Department of Aging. In this role, she assisted in the management of external affairs and coordination of outreach efforts. Emily Lungard is the State and Local Policy Director for the Enterprise Community Partners Ohio Market. She executes Enterprise Ohio's policy agenda to create and preserve affordable housing connected to quality healthcare, jobs, education, and transportation. She also leads their involvement in Lead Safe Cleveland, a coalition to address childhood lead poisoning. Emily came to Enterprise after a 10-year career in public service. She worked for Cuyahoga County government as the Director of Communications, managing media relations and external communications. Before that, Emily served as Cuyahoga County's first special assistant for regional collaboration, coordinating collaboration among 59 municipalities and facilitating state and federal lobbying efforts. Emily also worked at the Ohio Department of Development as a legislative liaison under both Governors Strickland and Kasich, and as an aide in the Ohio Senate. She has a bachelor's degree in history and political science and a master's degree in public administration from Ohio University. She resides in Ohio City neighborhood of Cleveland with her husband, Lauren. Maria Sosa is the Office of Fair Housing Manager for the City of Cleveland. She also manages the implementation and administration of the City of Cleveland's Rental Assistance Program and Right to Counsel. Additionally, Maria is an adjunct professor at Lorain County Community College, where she teaches legal environment of business under the Engineering, Business, and Information Technologies Division. Avendando through college, a culturally tailored curriculum that helps Hispanic students navigate higher education, and she is a member of the advisory committee for the Public Administration Program. Maria has a law degree from Case Western University School of Law, an MBA from Keller Graduate School of Business, a BA from Cleveland State University, and she also attended Miami University, the University of Puerto Rico, and is a graduate of Lincoln West High School in Cleveland. Maria grew up in Puerto Rico, moved to Cleveland as an adolescent, has lived in Texas, Florida, Virginia, and now considers Cleveland her hometown. I thank you all for your leadership, and I'm excited to learn from all of you. Let the presentations begin.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Maria Sosa with the City of Cleveland. Thank you for the Progress Institute for holding this, and we'll get started. First of all, I want to just give a little background if we could start the slides. The Fair Housing Act has protections. There are fair housing laws in the federal, state, and some local jurisdictions have protections as well. This is just an example of where the actual Federal Fair Housing Act can be found, the law within the Ohio Revised Code, and one of the local jurisdictions, the city of Cleveland, since that's the city that I represent. Next slide. But first, I want to talk about a little bit of a historical background on the fair housing, because many people might not be as aware of what is fair housing, and we're going to answer those questions, what is today, but it came from a long legacy and history for which we needed to have those laws in place. First of all, there have been historically a lot of impediments in place, even by the actual government, for housing discrimination that has led to housing discrimination throughout history. There have been ordinances that before they were outlawed, they were legal and in place, restrictive covenants, exclusionary rules and laws, and also underwriting guidelines for appraisals and the actual guidelines that were used to make approvals for mortgage loans. These are a lot of the things that historically had led to impediments, although a lot of the groups were able to achieve freedom from slavery and the women's right to vote and a lot of historical achievements, there were still a lot of other ways to discriminate. Next slide, please. So continuing with that, there was a lot of practices by realtors and a lot of patterns that led to abandoned neighborhoods and the lack of investment in those neighborhoods. All this led to basically segregation in the 60s that became more obvious, where any neighborhood that had African Americans or Hispanics and a large enough amount, which it didn't have to be that much as soon as they started moving, it created eventually two separate housing markets that were not equal. And this led to a lot of people doing a lot of activist work to move into a more equal society, since it was understood that housing was very important to achieve equality. Next slide. During the 60s, Martin Luther King was one of the persons that were fighting for this equality, and housing was definitely one of the key components to that. Him and those that fought for equal rights at that point in terms of housing understood that where you live mattered in terms of opportunity, and we needed to, instead of having two separate and unequal, move towards a more equal society. Now, the Fair Housing Act, they tried to pass versions of this, due in large part to the work of Martin Luther King during the 1966 and during 1967. It came to Congress, but it failed during those 2 years. But next slide, please. After the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, April 4th, 1968, within a week, the Fair Housing Act was actually passed. Obviously, it was a time, it led to a lot of riots and more of an obvious problem within the country. So it led for Congress in a bipartisan matter to join, pass, and President Lyndon Johnson actually signed it into law April 11, 1968. And for me, it's very important to understand, and a lot of people that work towards fair housing, this background, being able to move forward the work of Reverend Martin Luther King and everyone that fought and gave their lives for all these freedoms that we have right now. I know as a law student, I could only dream about doing some type of civil rights work, and through the work that I do through fair housing, it allows me to do that. So I'm very passionate into this type of work and share that with my peers that do as well. Next slide. So now we are in a day where fair housing is not an option, but it is the law. And to explain a little bit more about that, we're going to talk about protected classes. And basically, when a group of individuals share a particular characteristic, it is known as a protected class. Now, many of us, or all of us at some point, will be part of a protected class. Some people assume, oh, fair housing, that's for minorities or them. Well, if you could be naturally born into be one of these protected classes, but as you can see what they really are, we could all, or we will all probably be part of this protected class at some point. And that's a good way of looking at it, because equality and justice for everyone right now could also affect you individually in the future. Next slide. So we have, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, there are 7 protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familiar status, and disability. The last 3 were added later because they saw that there was a need, so they added those protected classes. They're a little bit of how they are defined within what is the Fair Housing Act. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that we have state and local fair housing laws as well. Everything I'm going to mention regarding fair housing now, I'm looking at it from the federal perspective and what federal courts have said regarding the Federal Fair Housing Act, but that protects everyone within the United States. State and local jurisdictions could not have less protection, but could have additional protections. And you will see there are additional protected classes within the state and some local jurisdictions. Next slide, please. The markets that are covered within the Fair Housing Act, it's rental, so apartment complex, the sale of real estate, lending, insurance, and basically anything connected within real estate transactions. And this could be for subsidized or private housing. So as an individual renting, or it could be an apartment complex owned or subsidized by the government. Next slide. The actual dwellings, like the actual household that it includes, is basically anywhere where someone could live. And that includes single family homes, temporary shelters, group homes. A lot of these, this is where someone could call a home, where someone could live. So the fair housing laws apply in all of those, including vacant lots within a transaction, a real estate transaction. For example, even though there's no structure, if that lot is gonna be used for residential purpose, it's also included as part of the dwellings protected from the Fair Housing Act. Next slide. Now, I include some of the language from the Federal Fair Housing Act, and underneath some of the cases that have defined what those laws mean. Many of the legislations and laws that are passed in different levels, they're passed with an intent. The intent here was for to have fair housing for everyone, and they put a lot of language, but the courts define further what that means. For example, the refusal to sell and to someone based on a protected class. And again, this is only enumerating the federal protected classes, but it applies to more protected classes once you go in the local and state jurisdictions. But the refusal to sell, for example, is protected. In one of the cases that I will mention, Traficante versus Metropolitan Life Insurance. In that case, I think very important one in terms of fair housing, because it's established who could bring a lawsuit. Typically, in order to bring a lawsuit, the person needs a real harm And there must be something that the courts could do, some type of remedy, and you need to prove that, for the most part, that you suffer the harm in order to bring the action. But under Traficante versus Metropolitan Life Insurance, that case, in that case, the court held that a lot of other people could bring a lawsuit based on the Fair Housing Act. Here, it was actually a group of white residents that brought up the suit because the apartment complex they lived on did not allow Blacks in the apartment complex. And although they were not the one being discriminated, they felt that the harm that they would have by not having a diverse complex will be real and substantial, and the court agreed. So this led to different groups being able to bring the action. For example, a lot of the actions are brought up by organizations within the community. You see legal organizations or community organizations, groups. So other than necessarily the person having the harm, which it's great in terms of resources and to cover the expenses and navigate the process versus just an individual. Next slide. So in here, it's talking about the different terms and conditions that could be offered and what is prohibited based on fair housing, on the Fair Housing Act. In one of the cases, United States versus Balestre, in Davis versus Mansard, those cases establish who could be liable. If someone, for example, under Davis works for an apartment complex and they were instructed that to offer different terms or try to exclude minorities from that place. In that particular case, it was an apartment complex. A group of a Black couple tried to rent a unit. They were told they were not available when in fact there were over 30 units available. And the court found that a person could be personally liable and the company as well. Before that, it was not clear whether, well, I'm just following instructions. That's what my boss told me to say. Well, based on after 1984 and moving on with other cases, for example, the actual company moving these type of practices could be liable, but the person could be liable as well. So that's why it's very important to have the knowledge about fair housing in general, so someone could avoid being personally liable for violating it. Next slide, please. Other conduct prohibited under the Fair Housing Act, and something I do, for example, I do check out different ads, whether they're published in the newspaper, which a lot of people don't do now, or online. And it is illegal to advertise in a way that that is letting the public know or that it's excluding anyone from protected classes. And what I see right nowadays, so you could find things like no children or adults only. Those type of advertisements are illegal because families are protected class, and family is defined as a dwelling where a household where there is at least one minor under 18. So unless they're specially already have a requirement, they're allowed to have people over 65 or over 55, and that's a whole approval by HUD. No one else could decide that they don't want families, that they don't want children. So that will be an example of an ad that will be against fair housing laws. Next slide, please. Now, and definitely representing that there are no dwellings or not allowing an inspection, anything that's a different treatment. What is the fair housing law is seeking to do is for fair and equal treatment in order for everyone to have the same choice. So it's everyone's choice once they get all the information, just like everyone else. Next slide, please. Then we have additional protections in place if they are this goes to realtors practice if they don't want to steer or they even make suggestions about what neighborhood will be better. And it's very difficult nowadays, perhaps, unfortunately, maybe not so much, but the language that is used, someone could say there are better schools in this neighborhood. But if they address anything related to any of the protected classes, then they could be in violation of the Fair Housing Act. Next slide, please. And in general, one of the important highlights about this language, it's that the difference in treatment relates to the person seeking to buy or rent a property, or it's involved, or anyone associated. So, and these are where they want to eliminate tactics of intimidation by maybe scaring the grandma or scaring someone else within the family. So again, the harm, in order to bring these actions, could be direct, or it could be in association, or it could be brought up as a bigger societal problem. Next slide. And again, making sure that everyone is treated and it's given the same opportunity, it's important. And one example will be the people with disability. There are certain things, and we'll go a little further. I believe Tanisha might mention this a little bit more in terms of what will be the process in doing a complaint. But if someone has a disability, they are part of a protected class, and there are certain things that are not permissible. Someone cannot immediately say, you have a wheelchair, you cannot rent this unit. They must do special accommodations, and to an extent, work with that tenant to see if they could accommodate them, so they could bring them up to a level that they had the same equal choice that everyone else has. Next slide. Now, like I mentioned before, all of these protections are offered in general. For the in Ohio, 2 additional classes are protected. That's ancestry and military status. Next slide, please. Now, for the city of Cleveland, we actually have under chapter 665, 7 additional protected classes. They're to the right. We have for the basic 7 ones that everyone is protected, and we also have it as part of that ordinance. And we have 7 additional ones: H, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, national origin, ethnic group, Vietnam era or disabled veteran, and ancestry. This is another very important thing to know, because, for example, someone that has been discriminated because they're part of the LGBT community, if they call HUD or if they search online for am I protected, they might not find that they're protected, and they're not directly within the federal level. There might be some exceptions, but overall, there's no actual protection, even through the state. So it's important for everyone to be aware that there are those local laws. They might or might not have them. Not all jurisdictions have local laws, but checking with your local jurisdiction, your city, your town, county, and see if they have any further protection, because someone from the LGBT community will be protected under the Fair Housing Ordinance in the city of Cleveland, for example. Next slide, please. Now, there are different routes that someone could choose to take if they have encountered a potential fair housing discrimination. There's the legal route, going to court directly. You always have that choice, or going through an administrative process. For example, for the city of Cleveland, because it's under our ordinance, we have our own ordinance with specific protected classes, additional ones. We have our own fair housing board that could actually review and adjudicate on findings. And we also have specific remedies under our ordinance. If someone calls the city of Cleveland with a potential discrimination, as a fair housing officer, office manager, I would investigate and determine if there is probable cause, and then escalate the potential case through the administrative process. So it's using administrative law within that ordinance, bring it to the Fair Housing Board, a hearing could be held, could be compelled to show up and show evidence. They have a lot of power in terms of what to do for someone that has been potentially harmed by someone violating the Fair Housing Ordinance for the city. Now, that's through an administrative process. They could always go to court, like I indicated, and depending what route they take, and it's up to the person, there's a lot of different remedies that they have. A preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order could be issued by a judge. That's more if you go directly through a case, like actually file in court a case. A preliminary injunction, temporary restraints, basically stops everything to avoid furthering the harm. Now, depending on what route it's taken, monetary compensation for damages could be awarded, and this could be both within the legal route or the administrative route. I know for the city of Cleveland, our ordinance has a remedy that has to do with monetary compensation, for example, and many local jurisdictions might have that. Now, these two don't exclude each other. Someone could use both the administrative process and also the legal process. In many cases, start administrative, and if we see that more it's required, they could escalate and also be filed through the court system, which if they started in a local jurisdiction, a municipality, or through an organization, many of them will help the individual with the court case, sometimes covering costs or them bringing the action as an organization, as a party, because as we established, the harm have been deemed to be greater if it's a societal problem. Now, if it's found that the actions were reckless and intentional, there could be punitive damages, which compensatory damages will be, I lost 3 months waiting for the apartment, and was not rented, I had to pay for storage. So what my expenses out of pocket, maybe inconvenience a little bit. Punitive damage could be awards of hundreds of thousands, even millions, based on trying to deter certain actions overall. These are usually going to be within the court system. Now, for example, if someone comes to the city of Cleveland, although we have our own process, we will, like, if there's a case on sexual harassment, for example, although it could fit within my jurisdiction, I might consider sending it directly to HUD because they could involve the justice system, and they have a special unit for those type of actions, sexual harassment as related to housing and fair housing. And that would allow for criminal charges and charges under the Fair Housing Act, and it could be greater punitive damages. So we all, everyone, at least that I know and I do, seeking to help within fair housing and further the cause, we'll look at different angles and see what is better for the client in front of us experiencing any type of harm. Next slide. Now, in order who to contact, anyone could go directly to HUD, but again, keeping in mind the protected classes might be limited, but at the same time, they might have other resources that a local jurisdiction doesn't have. They could also go in Ohio, and most states have some type of venue. In Ohio will be the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. They could also handle cases within the state level. And if your local jurisdiction or your county does not have a Fair Housing Act, that would be a great alternative. And anyone could hire a private attorney. There are some that specialize in this area, especially if they're going through the court system, or they could go to any community organizations such as the Fair Housing Center, which one of our presenters will be talking more about it. And I know the Fair Housing Center is a great partner for all of us working towards fair housing laws. They do a lot of great work about research and advocate for clients, and that I had actually brought up cases. And it is good to start within an organization, perhaps, because they could help the individual. Instead of hiring a private attorney, there are other ways that maybe they could get to the legal system if it's deemed more appropriate for that particular case. Next slide. Now, in conclusion, I chose this picture when I started working for Fair Housing. I did a Fair Housing for Everyone poster contest, and this was in 2016. Morgan Parker won, and this was displayed throughout the city. This is when I started with Fair Housing, the city of Lorain, and I just love this picture. I think she really captured what Fair Housing for Everyone should be about. A lot of the work that we do, again, for fair housing and people involved, we tend to be very passionate in seeking for everyone to have that choice in where they live. Where they live is very important and could determine so much. And though these laws were very important back in the 60s and 1968 when it was first signed into law, but it's definitely very important today. When I started researching about this, I remember coming across a sign used in Northeast Ohio in the 50s where it said, "No dogs and no Puerto Ricans," for example, allowed. And I'm from Puerto Rico, and I was like, wow, that was an actual sign posted somewhere. And just to think that as a Puerto Rican, I'm part of that protected class, but that could be anyone. That was someone that had the right to exclude. And I know it's a problem, and we want to alleviate those things by continuing to enforce fair housing. Everyone has the right to think and choose and have their own beliefs. And I personally not try to change any of that. And even people's prejudice, I think we all have our own prejudice. But my mission is for informed people. Because many times it's lack of knowledge, ignorance about the law, but knowing that acting upon those prejudice and choices and beliefs could be against the law. And if it is against the law, there could be consequences. It could be monetary consequences or other. So my mission as the Fair Housing manager for the city of Cleveland is that, and I will continue working towards fair housing for everyone. And now I will lead with two ladies that I'm glad that I share a lot of meetings and this work with. Tanisha Hunter from the Fair Housing Center and Emily from Enterprise, which are also very dedicated to the fair housing work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Maria. Thank you so much for that introduction as well. So again, I'm Tanisha Hunter with the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. And today I want to give you some quick information about the Fair Housing Center and the services that we offer. Next slide. So about the Fair Housing Center, our mission is to protect and expand fair housing rights, eliminate housing discrimination, and promote integrated communities. And our organization started as a grassroots organization in 1983, where fair housing advocates would just come together to talk about different issues. And we have since become a more focused fair housing agency. And that mission that I mentioned is really driven through some direct services, which includes direct advocacy, and that might include, supporting a victim of discrimination and exercising their fair housing rights, or assisting in the administrative complaint process. We have, as Maria mentioned, a phenomenal research team. So I do invite you to take a look at our website after the presentation, whenever you get some spare time. Our research team conducts research on housing and living patterns all throughout Northeast Ohio, which has really resulted in a number of policy changes. We have several different reports, maps, and publications related to fair housing that's interesting on all different aspects. And so I invite you to take a look at our research team on our website. And then of course, we just have education and community engagement. So just like today, going out or virtually doing presentations with community partners to empower individuals and so that they know their fair housing rights. Next slide. So as Maria talked about, if you in fact experience discrimination, you definitely can contact us at the Fair Housing Center. We offer free assistance to victims of housing discrimination. Our advocates take our complaints and they provide education on your rights, investigate the complaints, engage with the housing provider on your behalf, or support you in exercising your fair housing rights. And so as Maria stated as well, there are definitely consequences when fair housing rights have been violated. And so we'll talk about that in just a second here. Next slide. So if you do experience discrimination or you know someone who has, you can definitely give us a call. So who can make a complaint? Anyone. As Maria talked about, we are all members of a protected class, right? We all have a race. So we're all members of a protected class. So anyone can bring a complaint. Where can a complaint be brought? A complaint can be filed with HUD, as Maria talked about, the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, or your local jurisdiction. And then who can be sued? Just about anybody when it comes to fair housing, any owner of residential real estate, builders, managers, lenders, insurers, and zoning boards. Cities can be sued, real estate agents, brokers, and that is not an exhaustive list. Like I said, just about anyone. And then Maria talked about the remedies, actual damages, civil penalties, punitive damages, attorney's fees. And then the role of the government is really to enforce and promote the fair housing laws, right? So Maria talked about how different jurisdictions have their own fair housing laws. And so, it's up to the role of government to enforce those laws once they put them in place. And then role of fair housing groups, so roles of organizations like mine, really to eliminate, again, housing discrimination through education, research, including testing, and advocacy and intervention as well. Next slide. So, actually, I'm sorry, you can go back to the other side. So I want to talk a little bit about the process, right? So once you give us a call and you have a complaint, virtually all complaints that are filed with HUD are then referred to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission for investigation and potential resolution. And that's because the Ohio's fair housing law has really been designated substantially similar to the federal statute. And so after a complaint investigation, if after investigating your complaint, HUD finds that there is reasonable cause to believe that the discrimination actually occurred, it will inform you. Your case will be heard in an administrative hearing within 120 days, unless for some reason the respondent wants the case to be heard in federal district court. This is at no charge to you or the person that's making that complaint. And so if your case goes to an administrative hearing, HUD attorneys will then litigate on your behalf or, intervene in the case represented by your own attorney if you would like to. And then an administrative judge will consider evidence from you and the respondent. And so if the administrative judge then decides that discrimination has occurred, then those damages that we talked about could come into play. So again, compensatory damages or injunctive or equitable relief. So that kind of gives you an idea of the process once a complaint is filed. And if you give us a call at the Fair Housing Center, we'll basically help and advocate through that process along the way. Okay. Now, next slide. And so now that we've talked about history of fair housing. We talked about protected classes, covered property, and then the process when you maybe need to file a complaint. Let's talk a little bit about how fair housing is affecting all aspects of your life, right? And it's really, really tied to COVID-19. COVID-19 has affected just about every aspect of our lives today, right? I mean, even right now, how we're all meeting virtually instead of in person. And like many other crises, this pandemic has also really magnified issues that were already occurring as far as inequities and disparities. And so I want to talk about your fair housing rights when it comes to COVID-19, and then also bring some light to some disparities related to housing. And so this graphic here that you see that was created by our phenomenal communication specialist, Emily Martin, it says that a housing provider cannot treat you unfairly if they fear you have COVID-19. Know your rights. Next slide. And so COVID-19 protections under under fair housing law. People who currently have COVID-19, those who have a history, and those who are perceived as having the virus may be protected against housing discrimination under fair housing law. And really, this is in part of the basis of protected class of disability. Disability is defined as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And COVID-19 is really new to us, right? It's only been around us for less than a year now. So the long-term effects of COVID-19 are still unknown. But we do know that, it has really taken a toll on some people's health once they have experienced COVID-19. Substantially limiting one of their major life activities. And so the long-term effects of the virus on one's health and functions are really still being studied. We don't know what's to come years after as far as COVID-19 and how it impacts one's health. And so family members and those who care for those who have had COVID-19 may be protected as well, based on longstanding protections for people who are associated with someone with a disability. So under the federal fair housing law with disability, there's a certain definition that it has, right? So again, it's having limiting that one or more major life activities, but then also being perceived as having a disability, so how one perceives you, and then also having a record of having an impairment, and then anyone associated with or residing with a person meeting that definition. And so based on those longstanding protections, someone who has COVID-19, someone who maybe even be perceived as having COVID-19, like an essential worker, and then people who are associated with or residing with someone who have COVID-19 may be protected under fair housing law. And so the unlawful denial of housing, inquiries about a resident's COVID-19 status, or limitations to access of housing-related services may constitute illegal discrimination. And I keep emphasizing may like that because we have not seen case law yet in Ohio regarding this, but still want individuals to know and understand that these protections are in place in the event you do experience or know someone who experiences housing discrimination due to COVID-19. Next slide. Okay, and then I also want to talk about COVID-19 and domestic violence. And I want to talk about domestic violence because while it's not explicitly protected under fair housing law, under federal fair housing law, it's considered under the basis of sex. And it can, domestic violence can occur to either sex, right? You can be a victim of domestic violence, whether you're a male or a female. However, we know that women tend to be the majority of victims of domestic violence. And so since domestic violence is protected under sex, wanted to give some information about that because with COVID-19, we have seen an increase nationwide of domestic violence incidents being reported throughout the world because we're all staying at home, right? And so many people are staying at home with their abusers. And, in order to control the transmission of community spread, we're going to probably be staying at home like this for, months to come. And so that's just something to be aware of and think about as well, that, people who are staying at home with their significant others, maybe also staying at home with their abusers. And so as people are spending more time inside with family members, housemates, or significant others during this time, some are finding themselves isolated. Next slide. And so again, how it ties back to fair housing with domestic violence. Again, there are no explicit protections on the basis of domestic violence, but it is considered on the basis of sex. Survivors of domestic violence who are denied housing, evicted, or deprived of assistance based on domestic violence are protected in housing transactions. Domestic violence disproportionately impacts women. It can happen to either sex, but it does disproportionately impact women. And then 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. So if we think about the women in our lives, right? We think about our moms, our sisters, our cousins, our aunts. 1 in 4 women have experienced domestic violence. African-American women tend to experience it higher. And then there are some guidance that has been put in place by HUD on domestic violence, some protections. So in 2011, there was a memo on FHA protections for victims of domestic violence. So that has been put in place. And then also in 2016, guidance on the application of FHA to enforcement of local nuisance and crime-free housing ordinances against domestic violence victims has been put in place as well. So there are protections put in place for domestic violence victims, especially those who live in federal subsidized housing. There is a VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. So say, for instance, if there is an individual living in a federally subsidized housing and she is having issues with her abuser, stalking issues, and her home is not a safe place anymore, they can allow for an emergency transfer for her to be able to go to another home without any penalties in order to be able to avoid that abuser. Same for housing choice voucher recipients as well. They tend to have an addendum in their lease agreement for VAWA protections in the event they need an emergency transfer. So I just wanted to put that out there and in place because, like I said, with COVID-19 and this pandemic, we are seeing, nationwide an uptick of domestic violence incidents being reported. Next slide. So also want to talk about how COVID-19 impacts race, color, national origin protections when it comes to COVID-19, specifically with Asian Americans, right? They have become the target of xenophobic and bigoted attacks since the pandemic has been put in place, right? Because of where the virus is thought to have come from and different stigmatizations, we're seeing, outpour of different hateful behavior towards Asian Americans. I've actually had witnessed it in person right when the virus first started. And just wanted to note that it's absolutely not right and shouldn't be occurring. But then also just want to note that, protections are in place as well. So fair housing laws explicitly prohibit housing providers from discriminating against people based on their race, color, or national origin. So viruses don't target specific groups, right? Housing providers should be mindful of stigmatizing groups and harassment against racial and ethnic minorities. And then also as well for in situations where there are multiple tenants and you perhaps maybe have a neighbor that's harassing an individual based on a protected class, that's third party harassment. And so want to make you all aware that, a housing provider should be intervening in those situations. If you have or know someone, or, if there's a situation where there is an individual being harassed based on a protected class, and they report that to their housing provider should be intervening. And not intervening is actually a violation of the fair housing law based on the harassment. And so that's just something to note as well about COVID-19 on the basis of race, color, and national origin. Next slide. but also wanting to bring to light the disparities and inequalities that we are seeing now because of COVID-19. All these things um, have already been occurring, but we're seeing it really be shown to light because of this pandemic. So, structural racism and discrimination have perpetuated health and wealth disparities for people of color. Housing is inextricably linked to your health, right? Where you live matters, like Maria said. In a study by the Virginia Commonwealth University, and this was back in, I think, 2016 or 2015, maybe even a little bit before then. But what they found was that the life expectancy for those that live in the 44103 zip code, and that's near like the St. Clair and Superior area, was 12 years less than those living just 10 miles down the road in the 44124 zip code of Lyndhurst, right? So where you live matters, because where you live determines your health outcomes. It determines your access to transportation. It determines your access to jobs. It determines your access to health facilities, whether or not you live in a food desert. Where you live absolutely matters. Where your child goes to school, all of that is determined by where you live. And so we know that, our country, how it's, structural racism that has been put in place has really perpetuated segregation and moved people of color in areas in distress. So that's, of course, going to affect us when a pandemic it comes in place, right? Because people don't have access to, health facilities, proper testing, they may live in a food desert. All of those things are interconnected when it comes to a pandemic and where you live. So the Centers for Disease Control found that residential segregation is linked with adverse health outcomes and underlying health conditions, which can increase the likelihood of severe illness or death from COVID-19. So what we're seeing is that Black and Brown individuals are dying from COVID-19 at higher rates than the rest of the population because of one of the reasons because of where they live. Also, something to note about COVID-19 and how it impacts with housing is that, Black individuals specifically are overrepresented in the population of essential workers. So that's heightening their exposure to COVID-19. So again, going back to that whole aspect of where you live matters. So your access to jobs is really determined by where you live. And so Black individuals are overrepresented in that population of essential workers like janitors and grocery store workers and things of that nature. Also, it's something to note that unemployment rates are higher for people of color. In a report in April of this year, it was really exaggerated, the rates of unemployment for Black and Brown individuals in comparison to white individuals. And then also there are distinct disparities in home ownership rates for people of color. So right now, the disparities for home ownership, about 76% of white individuals own their homes, whereas it's around 47% of Black individuals. And we saw that when the CARES Act was put in place, it was overwhelmingly beneficial to homeowners and not to renters. So that's another disparity that's being brought up. So this is all to say that, where you live absolutely matters. And that's why it's important that people have the opportunity to choose where they would like to live free of discrimination. Next slide. So again, just to kind of drive that messaging home before I turn it over to Emily, without stable housing, everything falls apart, right? If you don't have stable housing, your health can be affected. Physical stress, mental stress, lead and toxic air pollution, all are determined by where you choose to live, right? Education opportunities, whether or not you live or your child lives in a failing school system, the graduation rates, all are connected to where you choose to live. Again, job opportunity, whether or not there are opportunities for higher paying jobs, long hours, no benefits, all those things are directly connected to where you live. So that's why we continue to drive the mission of fair housing, that individuals should have the opportunity to have the housing of their choice free of discrimination. And so I'll end with that and then turn it over to Emily. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanisha. Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Longard, State and Local Policy Director for Enterprise Community Partners. I'm going to start off the bat with a disclaimer. I am far from as expert in fair housing as Maria and Tanisha. I feel very humbled to be on this panel alongside them. They're extraordinary and their presentations were fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to try to make up for my relative lack of expertise with what I hope are some interesting, engaging, perhaps even exciting policy opportunities in fair housing. We've heard so much already from Maria and Tanisha about kind of what's already on the books in terms of fair housing protections, but that doesn't mean that there isn't more work to be done. There are challenges every day to fair housing and what we know is right. Oftentimes it kind of can feel like two steps forward, one step back. So I hope what I'm sharing today are in the spirit of taking additional steps forward because there's certainly more work to be done. I'll start with a little bit of background on my organization, Enterprise Community Partners. My joke here is that Enterprise, we're not the rent-a-car company. We're actually an affordable housing and community development organization. We work all across the country, including here in Ohio. We have an office in Cleveland, and we work on programs in our community. We work on investing in affordable housing, and then we work on policy. And that's kind of what my day to day looks like. One of the things that our organization does, and I think we do it pretty proudly, is we convene. We try to bring people and organizations together on housing issues, finding that our collective power is always stronger than any one of us kind of going it alone. So one of the groups that we've actually pulled together over the years is called the Fair Housing Working Group. So pretty aptly named for the presentation today. This group has been coming together for 5 years, believe it or not, since 2016. And it's all sorts of different organizations. It's affordable housing developers, community development corporations, fair housing advocates, local governments. Maria from the city of Cleveland is at the table. Tanisha's organization, the Fair Housing Center, of course, is at the table. And it's really just a unique group that comes together, maybe with a different approach or lens, or maybe even sometimes priorities for their own organization, but has a really shared collective belief. Um, that we need to be doing everything we can to remove barriers that families have to housing choice, and that we need to collectively work on systemic solutions to increase access to opportunity. So that's really what our group is all about. How can we increase housing choice for a family? And how can we increase access to opportunity for families as well? I'll just say one other quick thing about this group I think is really special. In my experience talking to other states in the country and other communities, they don't all have a working group like this. It's not necessarily entirely usual for local government and fair housing and affordable housing and community developers to be coming together around these shared issues. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, our public housing authority here in the county, our biggest one by a long shot. And they sort of half jokingly said, usually when I come together in a table with legal aid or maybe Fair Housing Center, it was across a mediation table. And perhaps that still happens and there's nothing wrong with it. But how wonderful is it that we also have this deep collaboration and partnership where we're working towards new solutions and actually expanding housing choice and opportunity. I want to share a little bit about what we've worked on in the name of housing choice. These are just some of the priorities we've had over 5 years, but not all of them, to be sure. And I'll start with a little bit of framing, actually. There's a robust body of evidence. I think we've sort of touched on this a little bit already that says that families who are able to move to neighborhoods of their choice that have connections to good schools and jobs, et cetera, do better in the long term. Tanisha was definitely talking about that, with talking about how your zip code has such an amazing impact on your outcomes in life. We know that families who are able to access neighborhoods of their choice have better health outcomes, educational attainment, have a better chance at overcoming intergenerational poverty. We also know that affordable housing paired with really intentional community building and community planning, like that our CDCs do in our neighborhoods, can serve as a tool to revitalize neighborhoods and communities. So we know both of these things to be true, and it's sort of in this spirit of both and that we focus on housing choice, and that our working group has said what really embodies this spirit of both and that we can work on and advance together. The first example here is voucher mobility. This is led in large part by the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority. They have obviously a really robust program called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's sort of colloquially known as Section 8. And the idea is that you want that voucher to be as mobile, as sort of movable throughout whatever community someone chooses as possible. So they've been working really hardly and smartly over the last few years to provide the almost wraparound services a family would need in order to not just identify their neighborhood of choice, but then to really thrive and succeed when and if they do move there. The other priority that we've worked on as a working group is around a thing called the QAP, and that's a shorthand for a very technical term called the Qualified Allocation Plan. That is a plan that our state government puts together, the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, to divvy up tax credits that build affordable housing. They're called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. This is an incredibly competitive an important tool to build affordable housing in our state and really in across our whole country. And the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, is how that gets divided up. And this has been a really sort of robust area of discussion for the working group because, like we said, where you choose to build affordable housing means that people will be living there. And we want to make sure that the QAP is not adding to concentrations of poverty or areas of segregation. We want to make sure that the QAP is really investing in affordable housing that we think is going to not only give people opportunity, but revitalize neighborhoods and promote community. So the working group has worked quite a bit over the years on making sure that the way that that document's written has that spirit of both and included in it. The other thing that we've worked on is a federal rule that I'll talk about a bit more when I get into federal policy opportunities, and it's called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. This is a cornerstone of that Fair Housing Act that Maria told us all about. It's been around since the 60s, but it really wasn't until the Obama administration and sort of a new rule that came out, I think back in 2015, that affirmatively furthering fair housing was really prioritized, and the federal government created some tools for local governments to better and implement it. And what it is basically saying we can't just say discrimination is bad. We need to do and act in a way to reverse the harm that we, especially our government, has inflicted over the years that's caused segregation. And so affirmatively furthering fair housing means you got to take proactive, active steps as local governments to reverse that discrimination that has occurred. So the 2015 rule was really helpful, and the working group was working with our local governments to make sure we were helping them affirmatively further fair housing. Unfortunately, that rule got sort of dismantled under the Trump administration. I'll talk about that more, but that's an area that I think we feel strongly on, and we had invested a lot of time. And the last priority I wanted to highlight here is source of income discrimination. This is actually what I'm going to spend most of my time talking on today. So you actually heard a little bit about it through Tanisha's bio, which I got to get that paper, Tanisha. It sounds like you wrote a really fantastic paper on source of income discrimination, which is a very real form of discrimination that is still happening in our community. So again, we've heard about all the protections that the current fair housing law provides, but that doesn't mean that it is the end all be all. There is unfortunately still a lot of discrimination, housing discrimination that is taking place in our communities. And one very real and persistent form of that is what we call source of income discrimination. So today, in most parts of Cuyahoga County and most parts of the state of Ohio, it is entirely legal for a landlord to refuse to rent to someone based on their source of income. So it could be their, their listing saying no Section 8, or you calling up and saying, no, I'm refusing to take your Section 8 voucher. That's entirely legal, and we believe that's a form of discrimination to someone based on their source of income. So we have a map here. This was created by the Fair Housing Center. They do extraordinary research, like Tanisha said, and you'll see more of their work here to come. But here you have a map, and each dot represents an area where vouchers are, and you can pretty easily see that they are clustered. They are not spread across the county as you would hope to see, where someone was being able to choose whichever neighborhood that they'd like to live in. And we know, based on research done by the Fair Housing Center, that landlords are denying voucher families more than 90% of the time. It's a pretty staggering number. So source of income discrimination, I mean, it just hurts us in so many ways. I actually included a photo here of a recent Cleveland.com story. Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer over the past year have actually been highlighting this form of discrimination and talking about it, which is really great. So I encourage you to look up the articles if you want to learn more. And some of what the articles will say, and of course what we will say as a working group, is that this form of discrimination, it hurts us all, and it has a tremendously very real impact. As an affordable housing organization, I'll say it limits the efficacy of what we have already in terms of affordable housing resources. I would venture to say that a lot of us on this virtual call right now really believe that affordable housing is important and we need more of those resources. But if a big form of those resources is, say, a voucher, and someone is unable to even make that work, we're really limiting the efficacy of what we're advocating for. Also, you got to keep in mind who these voucher holders are. So many of them are families, persons with disabilities, seniors, veterans. I mean, I could just list and list statistics that tells you who this is really hurting, but it is truly some of the most vulnerable among us. And then the last, but certainly not the least, probably one of the most significant things about this discrimination is that we know it is a proxy for race discrimination. Based on, again, some of the incredible work that the Fair Housing Center did, we know that often when someone is being told, no, I'm not accepting your voucher, that is truly a proxy for saying, I do not want a person of color or a Black person in my rental unit. So again, this is it's really just sort of unconscionable that this is continuing. But listen, don't take my word for it. I have a couple of videos from, again, the Fair Housing Center. I'm like a broken record about you guys, that I'd love to show everybody. So, in the interest of time, I may just play one of these instead of two, and hopefully it works. So here we go. Someone wave at me if you can't hear it, by the way.
My number one priority coming out of treatment and coming out of the sober house was to live somewhere that when I walked outside, there weren't drug dealers on the corner. Because I was very determined to stay sober. I go through treatment, I complete the program, I get a job working for the YMCA as a janitor. I was washing dishes part-time at a restaurant downtown. And it just was time to get housing. among the ranks to the homeless and people that are in treatment, the eating voucher is the gold standard. That's what everybody hopes they get, because this voucher allows you to pay your rent based on your income. This was my bridge to cross the Rubicon until I started making those phone calls. Because for me, I wanted to live on the west side of Cleveland because that's where my 12-step base was. Family members that lived over there that supported me in my recovery, as well as transportation was very reliable because there were several 24-hour transit lines. And I felt like with that voucher, there wouldn't be any problem. Nobody had ever told me what they told me on the phone. I called the first one, and oh, sir, we're so sorry, we don't accept vouchers. Okay, no problem, I'm good. Strike a line through it, call the next one. Well, about 11 properties down the list, I was starting to get really, really frustrated. I said, wait a minute. And it was like they were kind of like grinded in a little bit, because when they told me they didn't take eating vouchers, it's like they made sure, just in case I had something else, they dashed that hope too. Oh, and by the way, we don't accept Section 8, we don't accept Shelter Care Plus, and they named some other programs out there. And basically it was like, if you have a voucher, you're not living here. Nobody had warned me about this. And I was so scared. I did not want to go back under that bridge. I did not want to be living in garages and sleeping in alleys anymore. All the things that came with being a youth and drug addict.
Try to get to the next slide here. Yeah, deep breath. That's a pretty powerful story. I don't think anyone can really tell this story as powerfully as those experiencing it. So that was Willie. That was an incredible story. He does have a nice place to live now. I should share that. But I think if that hasn't convinced you, I don't know what will. That now is really the time for source of income protections. And what those would be is essentially the protections that would make this form of discrimination illegal. Maria earlier listed out for you all of the various protected classes, and what we can do, and what many places have done actually, is add source of income to that list of protected classes. I included a resource here, so we'll make sure that everybody here gets it. This is a organization, the shorthand is PRAC, Poverty and Race Action Council. I'm missing the other A there. But anyhow, they have tracked for years the number of jurisdictions that have already put this protection in place. So hopefully Cuyahoga County and perhaps state of Ohio and other cities within our county can add source of income as a protected class. Now is really the time for us to be doing it. We're now more than ever needing safe, decent homes. We're investing in things like rental assistance. We want to make sure that that's accepted everywhere. And we have had this new moment as a society where we're beginning to reckon in a deeper way with racial inequities. And if we're going to do things like declare racism a public health crisis, then we also need to be doing things like putting source of income protections on the books. So now it's how you can get involved, because we need really everybody pushing for these protections in our community. Of course, you can spread the word to your clients, constituents, your neighbors. You can talk about it on social media. This is our hashtag. We're going to have a sign-on letter. So the working group, the Fair Housing Working Group, is drafting something, and we'd love each and all of you to sign on to it. And then if you're interested, our group's open to all, and we'd love to have you. So we'll make sure you get my contact information. I'll work with the CMP team to make sure that you have all the ways to get connected. And then quickly, my very last slide here, I'll work through it quickly because I want to make sure there's time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about policy opportunities on the federal level. So I mentioned earlier some changes that happened on the affirmatively fair housing rule. There are actually two rules, that being one of them, and then the other is called disparate impact. These are both kind of cornerstones of our federal fair housing law, and they were essentially bolstered under the Obama administration years ago. For the sake of brevity, I won't really get into the details here, though. If there are questions, we can absolutely do it. And it's suffice to say that over the last couple of years under the Trump administration, both of these cornerstones of the fair housing rule have essentially been diminished, if not proposed to kind of be outright changed. There is a real opportunity, I think, with the incoming Biden administration. His platform, which I've actually excerpted here on the slide for you to see, specifically talks about affirmatively furthering fair housing. It's a tongue twister, and essentially reinstating that. So I think there's a real opportunity coming up. Like I said at the very beginning, sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Well, hopefully we're about to take a couple steps forward here with the incoming Biden administration. So like I said, I was going to quickly roll through that. I think we're handing things back over now to CMP or opening up for questions. If I don't get a chance, I just have to thank CMP, Melinda, Colleen, for giving us this opportunity. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank all of you, Emily, Tanisha, Maria, fabulous job. Really, really rich information. And we will, on your behalf, send out any additional information to the CDC universe. Again, grateful for your participation and for sharing such incredibly important information. I will say that video is incredibly powerful. We've noted a couple comments in the chat. I would encourage folks to put it under their signature line in their emails if they can, to help spread that word, and just encourage their connections to take a look at something that is incredibly moving and important and that we should sign on to. I'm going to turn things over to Melinda to pull out a couple of the questions that were in the chat, and we have 10 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. We have a few questions in the chat. The first is from Pat Shields, and they say, I am not in a protected class. My husband and I moved into Slavic Village because we felt it was important for people of some means to contribute to low-income communities. My husband passed away last December, and I would like to move into an apartment complex in my community. They have found I cannot do that, as all these facilities in my community are low income only. How does one advocate for mixed income housing that allows for all? That's a question to everyone on the panel.
I'll take a stab. Pat, I am so sorry for your loss first. For your first part of the question, or the first part of your statement, when you talked about not being a protected class, when Maria talked about protected classes, we do so in a way when we talk about everyone being in a protected class, because a lot of those are regardless of. So you're protected under the fair housing law regardless of your race, regardless of your religion, regardless of your national origin. And so that's why we say that everyone is a member of a protected class, because if you are discriminated against based on your race, no matter what your race is, then you are protected under the federal fair housing law. And so that's why we say everyone is a member of a protected class. And then I would say, for advocating for mixed income housing, I like to always think to start locally, right? So talking to your council person in your ward, talking to local advocates who are also interested in mixed income housing. I think establishing relationships with those individuals is the best way to start for advocating for mixed income housing. And I'll turn it to any of the other panelists if you'd like to chime in or add.
I think you did a terrific. Being involved, it's important. And it's all about what developers are developing in certain areas. And when you're involved and you let the local officials know, they might try to seek opportunities. But unfortunately, we don't have always the developers that are going to have mixed use in all neighborhoods. So I would say, you love the neighborhood, you want to be part of it. So start by being involved. Thank you.
I think Tanisha hit the nail on the head. Reach out to your local elected officials. Let them know that you care about affordable housing, that you care about living in a diverse neighborhood, and it's important to you. Just hearing that could make a world of difference. We also have state elected officials. We all have um, representatives in the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate. This is a place where a lot of our local funding for affordable housing comes from, and so they also need to hear from you. There are also easy links that you can Google or type in your zip code and find out who those representatives are. And I even goes so far as to say I'll put a couple of those links together for Colleen and the CMP team to circulate. But it's as easy as just letting your elected officials know that you care about this issue. They need to hear it.
Thank you. Yes. And the next question from Janice Small is, how can the Housing Center specifically support the work of Community Development Corporation staff members? In other words, for what kinds of situations should we be calling you for assistance?
Thanks, Janice. So fair housing can be tricky, right? Sometimes when I do presentations about fair housing, they're up to 3 hours long just because it goes really in depth about the different laws and different requirements under some of the protected classes. I can do at least a 2-hour training on disability protected classes sometimes. So with that being said, if there are any questions or any confusion about fair housing law, just give us a call. We can talk through, we might not be the right resource. Sometimes we get calls for, I need to move to a certain place, or I need to find a house. That's not necessarily what we do, but we're still happy to help and to walk you through and to provide you with the resources on where you might be able to find that information. So, if there are any questions related to fair housing law or just anything that you may have and not too sure about, give us a call and we'll help you walk through it. And if we don't know, we'll definitely get you to the right person that does.
Thanks for that invitation for CDCs to reach out. I know that a few are good, I should say a good healthy handful have worked with your organization, but expanding that resource and extending that invitation is important. And we'll be sure to get this information. It dawns on me, we do have CDC participation on today's workshop, but we have a very frequent CDC executive directors meeting, and perhaps we could do some interaction with any of you at an upcoming meeting, specifically around advocacy. I think would really, because a lot of times advocacy efforts do move from the ground up, and we need the CDC partnership to be part of that. So excellent.
Yeah, those were the main questions. There were a lot of comments on the video, though, how powerful it was, and how it puts everything into perspective. Jeffrey we did mention it took them over 6 months to find an apartment for an EDEN voucher holder, and he was homeless in his van in the meantime, and just kind of how heartbreaking that is to see firsthand. So we really appreciate you guys presenting this information and kind of bringing this to light again for us.
You do. Are there any questions that folks want to vocalize? Okay, assuming no one's on chat trying to speak. Actually, one just popped in. Are there any on the call who have creatively encouraged voluntary or voucher participation? Understand that a legal protection is best, but wondering if there is any success out there.
I'll jump in here and share a little bit about what's been done. One, again, on voucher mobility, but then two, engaging landlords. So first on the voucher mobility, if we can make it seem more accessible and remove the barriers for someone getting into a neighborhood of their choice, perhaps they're going to widen their search. They're going to look at new neighborhoods that before they might not have considered because they were concerned about finding a new school for their kids or making sure that they had access to solid transportation, et cetera. So that idea of supporting somebody with a voucher, I think is really, really critical. The other is just talking to landlords and connecting with them, getting them to understand the voucher program. You heard Willie's story. There's all sorts of different kinds of vouchers. The largest one in circulation is the housing choice voucher through CMHA, but there are others. So educating landlords, getting them to understand how the program works, what's being done to really make their inspections, payments as simple and easy as possible. I think those are two of the things that come to mind for me, and we're doing those. So to be sure, we're not just asking for this change in law and these protections, we're making sure that we're pairing it with these other pieces as well.
I would just also add, the city of South Euclid is one of the local municipalities that already has source of income protections put in place, and they created a phenomenal FAQ about accepting housing choice vouchers. And so I'll share that if anyone's interested in taking a look at that FAQ. It just really answers some questions, some of the tough questions that come about with housing providers and accepting housing choice vouchers.
Thank you.
I was going to say, we are getting a few more questions in the chat. I know we're getting limited on time. Emily, can you advance to the next slide so everyone can have your contact? Yes, perfect. I will try to get through these quickly. One question came in. There are landlords who do not consider accepting vouchers because of the requirements that must be maintained in order to accept them. How can that be addressed?
Well, this is probably a longer discussion than the 1 minute that we have. I will first just say that in almost all instances, what's really required is that someone have a rental unit that meets their local building code. So it's not as if there's these extra bars or hoops that a landlord needs to jump through in terms of their quality. It's really just maintaining the quality that we would ask of anybody. And yeah, I think that especially CMHA has done really yeoman's work. They've decreased their inspection from annual to biannual. They've actually increased the value and some of the higher sort of market values in the community. So if you're a place where rents are maybe a little bit higher, they're going to make sure that voucher is more lucrative in those areas. They've also hired a landlord liaison who just works exclusively to help landlords navigate the program. So I'm just listing a few of the changes that have taken place. In my experience, there's a lot of misperceptions about what it takes to become a landlord who accepts vouchers. And CMHA has done some really incredible work to make the program as seamless and easy to use as possible.
Excellent. I apologize. There's one final question in the chat that I don't believe we have time to get to today, but we will do some research and follow up and send it out to attendees. Ladies, Emily, Tanisha, Maria, thank you again. For our guests that participated with us today, thank you for being here. We look forward to continuing capacity development work and workshops like this in the future. Have a wonderful holiday season. Stay warm, stay safe. And again, thanks for being here today. Have a great day, everyone.